Good evening. I've just come out of the informal consultations of the Security Council, which continued the discussion on Libya after the Secretary-General had briefed the Council in open session, and I'm sure you all listened to or have seen his statement. Very pleased to say that there was a very strong endorsement in the Council of the approach that was reflected in the Secretary-General's statement that we're taking to planning the support of the United Nations to Libya as the conflict comes to an end. A very strong welcome for the fact that the United Nations system had engaged in preparatory work that puts us in a strong position now to be ready to respond to Libyan requests. One of the keynotes, of course, of our own process and now of the Secretary-General and all members of the Council is the importance of Libyan ownership, which is why, although we've done a great deal to inform ourselves about the likely post-conflict context, we have only done contingency planning until we were able to engage with Libyan transitional authorities. And as perhaps you know, we've intensified that process through discussions that Special Envoy Al-Khatib and I had in Doha last week, and further discussions that I then continued. That process will continue in Paris, where the Secretary-General will meet the leadership of the NTC, and I will be accompanying him there. And then we will be ready, I think, and the Council will wish the Secretary-General to communicate to it his initial proposals for an advanced UN-integrated mission to Libya, still on the basis that the longer-term United Nations role would be developed in discussion on the ground with Libyan transitional authorities, so that we're increasingly confident that it corresponds both to the situation in Libya and also to their wishes for UN support. One thing that is very clear is there's a strong wish in the Council, but also on the part of the NTC, that the UN should play the key role in supporting overall international assistance to Libya in the phase ahead. We are, of course, trying to get United Nations humanitarian personnel into Tripoli and elsewhere in order to assist with some of the urgent issues, particularly the crisis in the water supply, which the Secretary-General referred to in his statement, and a DSS team reached Tripoli today with more of what is necessary to prepare for the safe arrival of further United Nations personnel. And I myself, with a small number of colleagues, are ready to proceed to Tripoli if discussions in Paris with the NTC indicate that the timing is now right for that. Be happy to take your questions.
Is it possible to ask about the report that you prepared? And maybe that's what you're referring to about contingency plans, but there's one of these lines about that NATO will continue to have a role even after the fall of the Gaddafi government. Is that a UN position? What was the basis of that? And is it true that the military observers are no longer really under consideration, that the NTC has said it doesn't want it, as two ambassadors told us out front?
Let me distinguish two things. There is a report that was the culmination of the pre-assessment process for which I was responsible, which brought together all United Nations departments, agencies, funds and programs in an analysis of the Libyan context. That report, which is indeed a report, did not go all the way to proposing how the UN would respond, for the very reason I said, because of our sensitivity to Libyan ownership and our desire to keep that open, obviously because of uncertainty as to how the situation would finally develop, but also to engagement with Libyan wishes. Following that, last weekend, I reported to the Secretary General on the state of our contingency planning in different areas. One of those areas had been, and I'd previously briefed the Security Council on this, contingency planning for the deployment of unarmed military observers by the United Nations in the context of a ceasefire, which was, of course, what the Security Council sought in its resolutions and was a feature of the various roadmaps that were seeking to bring about a negotiated end to the conflict. So clearly in that context it was responsible to plan for the rapid deployment of unarmed military observers if necessary. And we also told the Council that depending on the security situation, deployment of unarmed military observers might only be possible if there was some kind of protection that would have to be provided other than by the United Nations. So that contingency plan has been there, but it was developed in a context which is not the context that has actually occurred. And in our discussions with the NTC, it's very clear that the Libyans want to avoid any military deployment by the UN or others. They are very seriously interested in assistance with policing to get the public security situation under control and gradually develop a democratically accountable public security force. The reference to NATO that you referred to wasn't an opinion of me or anyone else. It was simply a factual statement.
Could you please elaborate on the policing point, sir? What do you mean by that exactly? Are we talking here about international personnel or the Libyans themselves, or what kind of policing?
Well, clearly the development of policing must begin with the Libyans themselves, and in eastern Libya they have got back on the job some of the police who were there before the crisis, and then have been integrating into a public security force other militias that emerged in response to the security vacuum. Now, the situation in Tripoli today is analogous to that, and somehow the situation has to become one in which there is an effective public security force. Now, it's not yet clear. I mean, it's clear the Libyans are interested, feel probable need for some kind of international assistance. It's not clear what form that might take. It's not clear which international actors they might look to for that. Clearly there's going to be a long-term capacity development and training need for a police force, whether some earlier deployment of mentoring or monitoring police capacity. These are all issues still to discuss, and the United Nations is discussing with other possible international actors in that area, as well as with the NTC, who might be able to do what. Once again, there's not a plan in that respect. There was a contingency plan to envisage at what pace the UN could deploy United Nations police if that's called upon, and our early engagement with the NTC will see whether that's a path down which we should go.
Are you coordinating your work, sir, with Mr. Khatib, and how?
Sure. I mean, the very first time I visited Benghazi, it was with Special Envoy Al-Khatib. We were together in Doha in the discussions with the NTC last week. Now, there's always been a complementarity between his efforts to bring us, as it were, to the post-conflict phase, and my responsibility to prepare for the way the UN would respond thereafter. And it's been an excellent and completely cooperative relationship, and I'm extremely grateful to him for what I've been able to learn from his engagement with the Libyans.
Can you talk just very briefly about some of the challenges that you're facing setting up in the country, and what the broad goals are? I mean, when do you hope to hold elections? What kind of time frame are you looking at?
Well, it's not when we hope to hold elections, it's when the Libyans decide to hold elections. Now, the NTC has what they've called a constituent covenant, which sets out their roadmap. It talks of the establishment of an interim government 30 days after they declare quote, liberation, unquote, in Tripoli, and then the holding of elections to a national council in 240 days. That's the roadmap they've set out. We've done through the Department of Political Affairs Electoral Assistance Division a good deal of preliminary work as to what would be necessary to make elections feasible in a country which, let's remember, where there's essentially no living memory of elections. There's no electoral machinery, no electoral commission, no history of political parties, no independent civil society, independent media only beginning to emerge in the East in recent times. That's going to be quite a challenge, sort of organizationally, and it's clear that the NTC wish the UN to play a major role in that process, and so that'll be a key element, I'm sure, of UN support, and we'll be discussing with them, how we roll that out. So that's central. Another area that in our discussions with the NTC they emphasised a desire for UN advice is in the area of transitional justice. The very difficult issues they're going to face around the balance between accountability within the law for those who are responsible for egregious human rights abuses and the need for national reconciliation. So that too is a likely area from our discussions so far. Of course, the UN's already been active in the human rights area through the Human Rights Council mandate for the International Commission of Inquiry in terms of analysing the human rights violations that have taken place. So those are certainly key areas, but the Secretary General set out in his briefing to the Council the broad areas in which we would envisage the United Nations being asked to assist, but we need to develop that discussion further with the NTC, a little bit in Paris, but as soon as possible in Tripoli.
How long would you expect the military observers to be on the ground, and how can you prevent that from morphing into the kind of occupation force that was prohibited by Resolution 1973?
I'm sorry, I thought I said clearly we don't now expect military observers to be requested by Libya, so we're not envisaging the deployment of military observers. That was a contingency plan that most likely would have been called upon in the event of a ceasefire. Our discussions today indicate that they're not at all likely to ask for that.
The UN mission you're planning to Libya, how would you characterize it? Is it a peacekeeping operations, or is it not because it's not involving any armed elements?
Indeed, it's not at the moment being envisaged as a peacekeeping operation, on the assumption that there would not be a kind of operational deployment. It would be an integrated, politically led mission.
The Chinese ambassador Li Baodong had said that there should be a role for the African Union. I noticed in your contingency plan it's not, or at least whatever this document is, it's not really in there. What's your view of the role of the African Union in the post-conflict Libya?
Secretary General, as I hope you all know, convened a meeting on Friday in which the African Union participated, where again there was a strong consensus, including the African Union, on cooperation amongst the regional organizations with the United Nations and with the United Nations-led effort in the post-conflict period. That discussion will continue when the Secretary General meets, as he hopes to, the chairman of the African Commission in Paris, and we'll continue discussing with them how we work together as we've wanted to throughout. Thank you.